discussion will be chaired by Ambassador J.S. Deepak, the former permanent representative of India to the World Trade Organization WTO. The panel will discuss FTAs, the way forward. The panelists are Mr. Anup Wadhawan, former Commerce Secretary, Government of India, Professor Abhijit Das, former Head and Professor, Center for WTO Studies, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and Mr. Damu Ravi, Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. They will join the chair here in person, and Mr. Juan Carlos Baker Pineda, the founder and principal CEO, Ansley International Consultants, will join online from Mexico. Please come to the stage. I invite Ambassador Deepak to kindly start the proceedings.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking the Pune International Center, Ambassador Bambawale, and all its members for inviting us for this session. This is a session which will explore options related to strategy and trade policy in the context of India. We call it Are FTAs the way forward? Now, most of us are aware that trade is an extremely important part of international economic engagement. At the same time, it's a growth engine, an engine of growth together with consumption and investment. But for India, this engine of growth, unfortunately, has not fired in the last decade. Our exports have been flat, except for last year, which was different because of pent-up demand and increased commodity prices. So exports have been flat, and the growth of about 20% in the first decade of the century has been reduced to 3 to 4%. At the same time, imports have been stagnant as well. Again, the growth was of the order of 30% in the first decade of the century, and it's come down to about 4%. Now, both imports and exports are good for the economy. This is a premise I would like to make. Unless you have a major balance of payments problem, imports provide choice for consumers, cheap inputs for exports, and they also provide employment in sectors like distribution, marketing, logistics, banking, insurance, etc. Exports, of course, create jobs and help increase the GDP. Unfortunately for India, trade as a proportion of GDP has collapsed from 56% in 2011 to about 40% in 2010. Now, this is the scenario we have. Most economists through the ages, and Milton Friedman has articulated this, have been unanimous that trade is good for growth. Of course, trade rules need to be fair, universally accepted, and impartially implemented. And following this philosophy, India has followed the multilateral model of trade. Multilateral rules-based system as enshrined in the WTO, which provides non-discriminatory treatment for members and opportunity for negotiating agreements in trade in goods, services, IPRs, etc., as well as in disciplines on subsidies, both industrial, agriculture, and fisheries. The WTO also, till recently, provided an effective dispute settlement system, as well as the ability to engage in coalitions where like-minded countries could reinforce each other's wants and protect each other's red lines. Also, there was an element of consensus which made everyone feel that they were participating. Now, this model that we have adopted has not been a great success, except for a few outcomes. This strategy of engagement, primarily at the WTO, has not been for India like the incoming tide that would lift all boats. Therefore, we have been looking at an alternative strategy to have trade liberalization through free trade engagements. Now, it is not that we have not done FTAs in the past. We began a journey with an FTA with Singapore in 2000. Then we had deep FTAs with Korea and Japan, and with ASEAN and a number of other smaller economies. But have we done enough? That's the issue. This government, the present Indian government, came to power on an anti-FTA plank, but they seem to have had second thoughts looking at the situation that we are in. And we have had FTAs with Mauritius, with UAE, with Australia, and working on FTAs with Canada, EU, UK, etc. Now, obviously in FTAs, there are a number of issues which we do not face in multilateral. At the WTO, you have certain advantages of like-minded groups working together. But in FTAs, you are largely alone. Now, there's also issues like the political overhang on trade policy. If you look at the EU, after the World War, where they killed 5 million of each other, they decided in the interest of economy and trade to integrate. However, in South Asia, political issues have prevented us from coming together, and we have not been able to have a comprehensive economic partnership. Again, there is the issue of give and take. You can't do everything, and that, of course, is the basis of comparative advantage in trade. Any country has to choose sectors where it will protect itself and those where it will seek market access. You can, as you say in chess, you can protect the queen, the king, maybe the bishop, but you have to sacrifice the pawns. And so also it is in trade. You have to prioritize and look at areas where you have competitive advantage to focus on. And finally, there is a trade-off whether you liberalize for getting market access or whether you take back control in a the way it happened in Brexit, which was a reaction against globalization and offshoring of jobs and work. So these are some of the issues which I want to place as a way of stage setting. And we need to learn also from international experiences. FTAs became popular in 2008 after the Doha round at the WTO collapsed, and countries decided to work bilaterally or plurilaterally to set up trade agreements. The Latin Americans, who are aggressive traders, have the largest number of plurilateral and bilateral trade agreements. And the spaghetti bowl of FTAs has almost 500 arrangements, which are interlinked and overlap. Today, I have here a very distinguished panel of experts who would take you through this journey and look at various nuances of how India or any developing country can benefit from trade using the FTA approach. So let me start with our guest who's present online, Juan. He comes from Mexico, has negotiated the US, Mexico, Canada FTA, has been the Deputy Foreign Minister for Trade. And Mexico is especially important in the sense that it has the largest number of, it perhaps has the largest number of bilateral and plurilateral engagements, 14 of them with about 50 partners. So with those words, let me hand over the floor to you, Juan, on your insights on our FTAs, the way forward for developing countries, and more specifically for India. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for that kind introduction and those remarks that certainly help us understand the importance of the issues that we are going to be talking about. I regret that I am not there with you in person. I really wanted to travel to Pune, but my schedule in Mexico and some other engagements forbade me to do so. However, I am happy that the Pune International Center was able to provide with this connection for for me to offer you some reflections, as you said, Ambassador, from the perspective of my country. I would probably start by telling you that Mexico certainly has followed the path that you described. Mexico has anchored its economic growth for the past 3 decades on international trade. Beginning on the 1990s, Mexico was a relatively closed economy. Foreign trade and foreign investment were not really a significant portion of the economy. That changed in 1994 when Mexico negotiated the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that brought together Mexico, the US, and Canada. And that agreement basically unleashed Mexico's potential for tapping into international markets. Since then, Mexico has grown its exports by 7 times, its imports by 8 times, to the point that last year, 2022, Mexico's foreign trade reached 1.2 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. That represented about 82% of Mexico's GDP. So as you were describing before, Ambassador, certainly in the case of Mexico, that growth in trade and investment has translated into jobs, more jobs, jobs that pay better in Mexico. Jobs that are related to the export activities pay on the average 25, 27% more than jobs that are unrelated to those activities. Trade has also changed the face of my country, with several other geographical areas of the country becoming much more modern, creating better infrastructure, better services for the citizens as those regions start to develop international links. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean, of course, that Mexico's experience has either been easy or has been void of difficulties. I would probably say that with the current situation, what Mexico has experienced goes hand in hand with the description that you offer. The international environment has grown skeptical of trade liberalization. Countries, some stakeholders, political forces, NGOs, trade unions have also grown skeptical of trade. So negotiating free trade agreements has become more complex, not only because of the topics that they incorporate. Free trade or free trade agreements used to be mostly about elimination of tariffs, but the latest generation of free trade agreements that we are seeing not only include market access, but they also include very complex disciplines such as labor, the relationship between labor and trade, labor and environment, state-owned enterprises, rules for the operation of state-owned enterprises, e-commerce, services, so on and so on. So the contents of the agreements themselves are more complicated. That's point number one. Point number two, market access is not necessarily guaranteed in those new agreements, because a few years ago, I would say probably up to 2015, when the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations were concluded, the understanding of countries participating in those negotiations was that in exchange for adopting such ambitious disciplines, the country will receive market access in return. Okay, but with the latest movements that we have seen, for example, in the case of the US, the United States, with the launching of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, well, again, the disciplines are still there, but the market access does not necessarily go hand in hand with the adoption of those disciplines. So that is a substantial change. That, in my mind, reduces the appetite for certain, but it might reduce the appetite that certain countries may have for engaging in those agreements. No. Finally, trade agreements have also become more complex because of the enforcement procedures that they follow. You, Ambassador, were describing at the beginning how the WTO provides for this dispute settlement process. But the dispute settlement process and the follow-up of the contents of the last generation FTAs is far more strict than that. In the case of, for example, Mexico again, in the USMCA, which is the agreement that superseded the NAFTA back in the year 2020, there is not only the dispute settlement for traditional market issues, market access issues, but there's, for example, a specific dispute settlement procedure that it is set singly, exclusively for labor disputes. So as you can see, those mechanisms for enforcing and eventually stop the flow of goods, well, not only have they increased, but they now also touch upon several other topics as well. And the possibilities of disruptions to trade, well, certainly are larger, no? Mexico's case, as Mexico went from this first wave of free trade agreements back in the mid 1990s to the early 2000s, Mexico negotiated in those years agreements with the European Union that went into force in the year 2000, with Japan that went into force in the year 2005, and the one that I referred to already, the NAFTA. Then on the second wave of agreements, Mexico started negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the year 2012. And then once that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, that was hard. Once that Donald Trump came into the White House in the year 2017, well, Mexico knew that it needed to upgrade its framework for conducting business with the U.S. That led to the USMCA, which is the current agreement ruling trade relationships between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. And that new agreement follows basically the path that I described for you. The US's intention on renegotiating the NAFTA was to reduce market access. That was the explicit objective stated by the White House. Obviously, for Mexico, that was unacceptable. The other objective that the US also stated clearly was that new disciplines needed to be incorporated into the agreement. Those that I quoted: labor, environment, digital, e-commerce, state-owned enterprises, and a few others. And well, finally, to make sure that the agreement worked in the terms of enforcement and dispute settlement. The agreement, with all of this description, I'm not trying to say that the trade has become more complicated or trade has stopped between Mexico, the US, and Canada, which is the example that I am quoting. On the contrary, in the past 2 years, Mexico's trade with the US has increased by almost 17%, meaning that Mexico is now the second largest trading partner of the US. In conclusion, so as to leave enough space for us to discuss, I will tell you that in Mexico's experience, in my country's experience, trade certainly is an engine of growth. Trade creates jobs that pay better, but that flow of trade doesn't come free of strings, or there are strings attached to that, in the sense of increased level of obligations with other trading partners, in terms of an increased oversight and an increased enforcement on the part of other countries. In our particular case, well, the US, the United States is clearly that particular partner that we're always monitoring. And trade will continue to be complex with those trading partners, even in the face or even in the existence of an agreement, because there will be more and more elements for enforcing those disciplines going forward. I believe that this model, at least on the part of the US, the rules with market access attached to it, stricter rule with market access attached to it, will be replicated. I unfortunately, and this is regrettable, I do not see conditions presently so as for the WTO to lead another wide effort for liberalization. So my expectations would be that trade agreements will continue to be negotiated, but the characteristics of this third wave, so to speak, of trade agreements are going to be very, very different, including, well, some of the elements that I quoted, and some other elements that, at least in the case of Mexico, have not made its way into the main framework of agreements. But I've heard debates about the convenience, for example, of including not only labor and environment topics into those, but why not human rights? Or why not, all the many other items on the agenda of topics discussed at developed countries, no? Women empowerment, gender issues, so on, so on. So the reality is that the complexity of the agreements will continue, but I am confident that the agreements will still be negotiated, even though under those complications. I will stop
Thank-
here, Ambassador, to hear the
Thank
other
you.
panelists, and I look
Thank
forward to
you,
questions and
Yuron,
answers.
for that perspective, especially highlighting the increased complexities of trade agreements, both bilateral and plurilateral. The way we've structured this panel is that each of the panelists makes an opening statement of about not more than 8 minutes. And thereafter, they have a second chance of 2 to 3 minutes to comment on what each other has said, and I'll put some questions to them. And that should leave us about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Anup Udhavan, former Commerce Secretary of India, a trained economist who has very long experience of trade, of negotiations, both at the WTO and bilaterals, and helming India's trade policy. So over to you, Anup. The floor is yours for the next 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deepak. And my thanks at the outset to Gautam and the Pune International Center for making my presence possible at this wonderful event. So clearly, hearing Deepak's remarks and Juan's remarks from Mexico, there is no dispute perhaps that, trade liberalization and openness are good for countries in principle. Yet FTAs remain highly controversial. So I will attempt to, on a somewhat theoretical basis, deconstruct FTAs and try to understand, where the truth lies in terms of benefits from openness and, of course, benefits from FTAs, and why they are controversial in spite of an overwhelming understanding that, trade liberalization and openness are desirable. So, in a sense, by confining ourselves to FTAs, we are limiting the discussion. The broader issue is the benefits of trade liberalization and openness and how we can optimize these objectives. And based on that, we can arrive at some conclusions for FTAs. So as we discussed, it is, widely accepted that, liberalization of trade and openness is not just, desirable, but it's a necessity. For instance, self-sufficiency is not a possibility for any country. Even a country like China, which has huge presence in almost every value chain that is there in this world, even they cannot be self-sufficient. By definition, resources and capacities of countries are limited. So self-sufficiency is not an option. And of course, human wants are limitless. It's, I think, not possible for any country to say that, our people don't need the diverse goods which are available across the world, whether it's cell phones or laptops or whatever. So we are not a nation of hermits. So to that extent, trade openness and liberalization are a necessity. And, more importantly, beyond being a necessity, it is economically beneficial. And, notwithstanding arguments which are given sometimes, for instance, on grounds of infant industry protection, which are arguments for limited protection for a specific purpose for a limited period. But experience has shown that once you bring in those tariffs, then it's very hard to get rid of them. For instance, look at India's auto industry, auto components industry, huge success story with some protection it had, and of course, conducive conditions domestically, but then getting rid of those tariffs is going to be very difficult, and in some ways, the industry and consumers will pay a price for that. And I think the advice today is to have infant industry subsidies rather than infant industry protection through tariffs. And I think the PLIs, the production linked incentives, are demonstration of this fact that these subsidies, again for a limited time period, can give a better supply response than tariff protection. We had tariff protection for years and years, but the supply response has been very limited. The PLIs, which are targeted subsidies, outcome linked subsidies, they've had much better response. And of course, sometimes an argument is given that certain traditional sectors require protection, for instance, agriculture. The stories about Japanese protecting their rice are legendary. But all these efforts, if you look at the developed world, all these efforts to protect agriculture is at the margin. Agriculture is 3 to 5% of their economy in terms of output and in terms of labor force employed. So at the margin, if 95%, 97% of your economy is working efficiently without distortions, you can protect 3 to 5% without paying much of an economic cost for that. So that again is at the margin. So clearly, the arguments of protection are through tariffs are at the margin. And I'm of course not advocating a dogmatic approach that you should have openness in a kind of mindless and indiscriminate manner. There is scope for a strategic stance in key aspects, as we are seeing today. When you're looking at the de-risking of supply chains, that it has elements of strategic, trade-related decisions, strategic investment-related decisions. So there is a lot of scope for strategic decision-making in trade, in investment decisions, which countries must take, but the broad predominant orientation has to be towards openness. And protection, strategic decisions have to be relatively at the margin. And of course, unfair trade practices we have to act against, whether it is through anti-dumping, countervailing, or safeguard duties. I'm not advocating that you abandon action against unfair trade practices. In fact, that is what makes openness controversial at times. That is what makes openness unacceptable at times. So trade defense is an important aspect. But there again, you see a lot of times, if you see our own DG of Trade Remedies, his recommendations are often not implemented by the Ministry of Finance because it's hard to implement them in terms of the economic cost they extract on the users, on the various manufacturers who are using those inputs. Those duties are unsustainable economic burden. So there again, you see that openness, in a sense, dominates all other considerations. And again, the historical example also demonstrates this, that long-term, all-encompassing protective barriers have not been the recipe for economic success. You look the world over. And of course, what is advocated today is more strategic, more cleverly determined, non-tariff measures which are behind the border. As your economy matures, as your industry matures, you have behind the border measures, standards, etc., which provide protection without acting as a barrier for inputs from abroad, which tariffs create. And it is the age of global value chains. Tariffs at the border lead to frictions at the border and prevent quick movement of goods and services. And that is, in fact, not conducive for global value chains, which are the essential form of globalized economic activity today. And, above all, we need to remember that welfare comes from consuming goods and services. It doesn't come from preventing trade. And if you look at, autarkic situations across time, across space, it is clearly demonstrated. You look at India before 1991, we had a case where our real incomes were low because the goods and services people wanted to consume were not available. Any basic good, whether even something like a nail cutter or a watch or, some expensive cloth had to be imported, and people depended on relatives bringing them from abroad. There were stories about customs auctions where people would get such goods. So I think those of you who grew up in those times will appreciate that barriers to trade are recipes for lowering the welfare of citizens in terms of what they can consume. And the other aspect we need to remember is that openness opens the door for bringing in foreign competitiveness, the competitiveness of your trading partners in terms of producing goods of high quality at the lowest possible prices in the world. Though that competitiveness enters your economy through openness, and it creates value chains which are often unseen. And when there is a disruption, recent COVID period, we saw some disruptions in value chains, then you realize the economic cost of not allowing those elements of foreign competitiveness to enter your economy. So that's an important thing, we need to remember. And of course, the other argument people often give is predatory pricing. That, China, for instance, that they are clever, they will price their goods low, and then when your industry is destroyed, they will raise the prices. So, experience now over 40, 50 years shows that there is no such systematic strategy for predatory pricing. That competitiveness, which leads to low prices, which we are benefiting from, that is fairly enduring and that is ongoing. So this whole fear of predatory pricing is, I think, misplaced. And, we need to remember indefinite subsidization is not possible for anyone. If China was, or what our trading partners were indefinitely somehow subsidizing their products, that is not a possibility. We could have done it had it been so easy. So somewhere you need to learn that the critical thing is competitiveness. How do you achieve competitiveness? How do you emulate your trading partners and achieve the kind of competitiveness they have? And that is the thing to be emulated.
May I stop you?
Okay, so I'll just wind
come
up.
back to you again.
Yeah, so the key element is competitiveness, and I'll make the rest of my remarks later. Thanks.
Thanks so much for emphasizing that trade openness is not only desirable but necessary, and maybe infant industry protection through subsidies is a better bet than through tariffs. And competitiveness can come through openness. I would now turn to Professor Abhijit Das, who has experience of implementing trade policy and has been for the last dozen years and more as head of the Center for WTO Studies, backstopping India's negotiations and writing books related to them, and has been a speaker on FTAs in more than 20 countries. Abhijit, your floor.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I'm extremely grateful to Ambassador Bambawale, Pune International Center, and the very dedicated team for organizing this wonderful Asia Economic Dialogue. Let me make 5 or 6 very quick points. The first point which I want to make, it goes back to what one of the speakers said in the first session today, which is that tariffs play a very small role in overall trade growth. Let's remind ourselves that there are many other factors besides tariffs, such as logistics, infrastructure, transportation, that are very, very relevant for growth of trade. So if we are looking at trade agreements which are based around tariffs for enhancing our exports, then maybe that's not the right way. To give you just one illustration, there's a very detailed study by UK's Department of International Trade, which has tried to quantify the likely increase in India's exports to the UK if an FTA is signed between the two countries. What it says is India's exports to UK will increase of both goods and services by about 10 billion pounds over a span of 10 years. That will barely be a drop in the ocean. But having said that, it's important to recognize the second point, which is that trade agreements are no longer exclusively about trade. They are about regulating a whole host of issues. Juan Carlos mentioned quite a few of them. And on many of these issues, the attempt is, if I can put it in very simple terms, may be largely accurate, but may not be 100% accurate. The attempt through most of these non-trade issues is to freeze the first mover advantage of successful entrepreneurs in developed countries. That is a point which we need to bear in mind. Some of these non-trade issues which are there include things like marine litter, plastic pollution, pollution caused by ships. How should countries bring in changes in their regulations? How should they introduce new regulations? What should countries do to fight corruption? What type of trilateral partnerships could be there for capacity building, so on and so forth. So the short point is, when we enter into trade agreements, particularly free trade agreements, with developed countries, we will be confronted with these issues. We will have to make choices. We will have to weigh costs of entering into these agreements as well as costs of staying outside. With this broad parameters in mind, a very quick dive into two important areas. We've heard a lot of discussion on sustainability over the past 2 days. Very, very important area. But what do FTA provisions on sustainability do? If we look at what European Union has demanded of India, and this is in public domain, no state secrets being leaked, the first thing is it goes against the grain of trade liberalization. It seeks to provide a legal justification for erecting barriers on imports of other countries on the grounds of protecting environment. A mention was made of carbon border adjustment measures in the first session. Let me also add that the European Union is in the process of implementing something called a deforestation regulation, which effectively means that after they have cut down their primary forests over the past 200, 300 years, they want to shift the burden to their FTA partners for protecting primary forests. So the first point on FTAs with developed countries like European Union is that they go against the grain of liberalization. The second important point is not only will they act as barrier to our exports, they create a very strong barrier, or they could create very strong barriers to domestic production, particularly of green products. And this is likely to happen through commitments in large number of areas, including standards, non-discriminatory government procurement, lowering of tariffs on so-called green goods, liberalization of services, etc. My point is that all countries have to transition to a low-carbon economy, no doubt in that. But should this transition be overwhelmingly import-dependent? Certainly not. We need to create our own domestic producers of green products, green technologies, green services. But if we look at what is being demanded of us in some of these FTAs, I'm afraid the path ahead through the FTAs will imply almost an overwhelming import dependence on green products. Linked with this is the issue of PLI. We've been hearing about the benefits of PLI from many speakers. Well, in the FTAs, there is a provision on something called competition, and over there, there's a provision on something called competitive neutrality, which would really dismantle our PLI, particularly in the electronic sector. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that is the likely implication. So in conclusion, FTAs We have to be very careful in choosing our partners. We've done an excellent deal with Australia, no denying that. But when we are negotiating with European Union, or if we are negotiating with UK, or when we are partnering or engaging with the United States and 12 other countries under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, we need to just keep one point in mind. Will the obligations that emerge compromise Atmanirbhar Bharat? If yes, do we have the leverage to make sure we do not agree to such commitments? On that, we really need to negotiate hard. So while WTO negotiations are time-consuming, they are arduous, they give you an opportunity to take a well-informed negotiating position with help of other countries who might articulate similar positions. The possibility of protecting national interests are much higher compared to a situation where we engage in an FTA negotiation with a developed country and keep ourselves susceptible to huge power asymmetries at the negotiating table. Final message, no going back or giving up on WTO. That is an organization we have to strengthen, and that is the way forward. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your very kind attention.
Thanks, Abhijit, for that very interesting perspective. The debate is now getting interesting. FTAs are about openness, enhancing our competitiveness, getting us market access, but also there is this danger of freezing the trade rules, the status quo, which is non-level for countries, developing countries like India. So what is the trade-off? The next speaker, we have the good fortune of having Mr. Damu Ravi, who has very rich experience of working in the Commerce Ministry, leading the RCEP negotiations on behalf of India, and today he's Secretary Economic Relations in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Damu has struggled with some of these issues in the RCEP negotiations, the level of opening, how do you reconcile Atmanirbhar Bharat with reducing tariffs, and what is the kind of preparation and reforms we need to do before we can enter this kind of an agreement which India had to walk out of. So Damu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon to all of you. And at the outset, let me first thank the Pune International Center, the Asia Economic Dialogue for giving me this opportunity, both for this session and also in the morning session. And thank Ambassador Gautam Bambawala, my senior colleague, for doing this extraordinary event. I must also acknowledge that both to my right and left were my bosses one time. So I learned a lot being with them. And I continue to learn from them even now. Of course, Abhijit is a dear friend, a batchmate, and is someone who is a trade expert for a very long time. So his ideas are constantly stimulating. But I would like to, a topic of this is a very touchy, because opinions will differ. And I think one need to be candid about how trade is happening and what is it that India need to do and how it should look at these developments. But let me take a very broad spin on that. I think we have to see how trade has evolved in the last 3 decades. I think that's a very important and objective assessment we need to make. What has happened since the WTO formation, and maybe slightly before even that? Trade has increased. Trade has increased not because nations have started to only do limited trade, but actually trade have increased because they liberalized rules, they looked at the opportunities beyond the borders, and it multiplied, and it seemed to have a great impact. I think everybody agrees that liberalization of trade helps economies, it brings benefits to its people, it has its own ripple effect. I know the WTO rule book is very important, but what it does is it's actually a lowest common denominator, because you are across spectrum of nations that you are trying to make a rule book with developed to developing countries to least developed countries. So naturally, the rule there tends to be of a certain level and not beyond. So nations are aspiring. Their ambition levels are differing. So an aspiring nations want to have a higher ambition trade activity. So what they do is they enter into free trade agreements. I think the WTO rule books, as you agree, sir, allows for that kind of trade agreements of a higher level. Now, and we have seen again in the last 3 decades that there have been more FTAs coming into play. I think the WTO rulebook very clearly says about over 200. I think when I was in Commerce Ministry, my number at that time was over 200 or 250 FTAs were already in motion, and another 200 were still being negotiated across the board. And then you got into regional grouping agreements. You had the TPIP, TTIP, the RCEP came, and then you have the NAFTA. But I think another important thing we are seeing is, again, the regions amongst themselves working towards a common market. Now, European Union is a very classic example here. ASEAN is another classic example. NAFTA is another classic example. They don't call these FTAs, but I think what they've done is they've collapsed all that restrictions that they have within that market to achieve greater trade among themselves. I mean, look at typically what happens in European Union. More than 80% of the trade is intra-European trade. Look at the ASEAN thing. More than 40 and close to 50% is intra-ASEAN trade. And in NAFTA is so. There is a higher, deeper integration of the economic activity that's happening in these regions. Now, what does it mean? SARC is, in that sense, is a very low ambition. The SAFTA is a very low ambition FTA. So our intra-SARC trade is just about 5% of its global trade. So what does it mean to us? When regional groups, when a group of countries stitch a very ambitious FTA, we have to understand what it means to countries like ours, which are on the rise, whose economies are going to grow. Today at 3.5 trillion, very soon it'll be 5 trillion. In about decades time, another 10 trillion. The ambition level is 30 trillion by 2050. So we are not going to sit and then look at our own domestic turf. It is natural that nations like us, will engage outwardly. There will be much more aggressive engagement with outside world. And we have to understand that this is not because the policymakers want it. It is because the aspiration of the industry is such that they will be moving out, both in terms of trade and also in terms of investments. This is a natural progression. And I think at the policymaker levels, we have to understand that not engaging in the free trade agreements and not engaging in trade agreements, what are the costs that we will have to face, is something which we'll have to very carefully understand. In my view, not engaging, the cost will be enormous. We have to recognize this. Now, as Abhijit said, which agreements are important, which are not agreement? Are there the rules already stitched in favor of the developed countries with close options for our industry? Is something which we'll have to debate. It requires a deeper debate and deeper understanding of what it means to us. Of course, today the trade is not about tariffs. It is even beyond. It has gone non-tariff barriers to, I think the previous speakers have mentioned about it. It's become even a very sophisticated game. We are still in the tariff game, thinking that the tariff will protect our industry. But they are into non-tariff game. But their protection levels are looking at a very small niche areas of items. Now, whatever it is, in my view, any nation, and across experience tells us that the more you protect your industry, the more damage you do to yourself. I think that is very important takeaway. When you look at the broader spectrum of it, I think trade protectionism does more damage to you. Why? Simply because you are preventing components and raw materials and intermediate products coming in cheaper to be able to feed into your manufacturing activity. I think that's what we need to understand. Now, which are those lines you need to really protect? If it's a fully finished product, I fully agree. That requires protection. But there's a different level of lines, tariff lines, which are necessary for the industry to become competitive. Now, we always think that doing an FTA is something like, the experts will go and negotiate and come back and then they sign it off and fine. But actually what it requires is a deep preparation. First, we need to understand where we are. Where is the industry in each line, in each sector? and how much of it liberalization can happen, and what is the staging that need to be taken. No, these are the calculations that goes closely hand in hand with the industry. That is why industry consultations become very crucial here. Now, once you have done an FTA, there is another element to it. There is a constant monitoring of how this FTA is going to really work for you. Is it benefiting or not benefiting? We need to also educate the industry of the benefits and preparation for facing the liberalization. Perhaps there is a need for, again, giving support to those industries which tend to have difficulty in the transition. And we also need to monitor that as nations around us stitching new FTAs, what it means to us. Does it take away the market share? Does it access to market is being denied because someone else is stitching an FTA among themselves and you are not part of that? So these are the issues that we have to understand very well, which is why trade is increasingly becoming not as a binary game. It is very strategic. And we have to understand that it is a strategic game. Countries, very advanced countries, have realized this very early in the decade. What have they done? They have built foreign service and foreign and trade ministries. It is just not foreign policy. It is a foreign and trade. That is a strategic thinking, and we are not in that thinking as to how important trade is, not only for the country, but also geopolitically what it means for us. So, I mean, Abhijit had mentioned about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Yes, it's very important, Atmanirbhar Bharat. But trade and investments are also very interlinked concept. The more you have trade liberalization, the investment tend to happen. Because if you look at Japan and Korea, when they negotiated FTAs, actually they thought about investments and then negotiated FTA. They thought, which lines they need opening in from India. That is how they're done. It's a very, very strategic, they went ahead. Now, today when you're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, you also need opening for your products because you will become competitive. You're not going to make your products under the Atmanirbhar Bharat for your own domestic market, but you're going to take it out of the country. And when you take it out of the country, they need to be competitive. They need to be competing with the best in the world. So these are the thoughts that I have. But I think, as Abhijit rightly said, tariff is one part of it. A whole lot of work needs to be done in the trade facilitation. I mean, look at our own, the entry and exit points. Are we improving those elements? Are they becoming impediments for trade? These are the few thoughts I like that I'll come back again later. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Damu, for emphasizing that FTAs allow trade ambition and they allow you to go to the next level. And there may be costs of not engaging, which we do not know. There is a big school of thought which says that if you are not at the table working to frame rules which will then become international standards, you're likely to land up as being part of the menu. So it's a difficult area, and there are views on both sides. Now, let me get back to our panelists, starting with Yuan. Short period, we are running a little behind time. 2 minutes. There is an argument that with strategic partners, for India, you say India and US are strategic partners, and we should strengthen this partnership by having a free trade agreement. You have a rich experience of negotiating with the US. There's the other thought that US is a heavyweight, we are lightweights as far as the economy is concerned. Will we get debarred? Is it fair to treat unequals as equals? And will we be able, as a developing country, to meet some of the asks of US as far as golden rules of trade and non-trade issues are concerned, some of the things that Abhijit alluded to, which might affect our economic management and ultimately maybe even sovereignty. So, and maybe if you could also, for the audience, give a key message to take home. 2 minutes.
Of course, Ambassador. Thank you. This has been a very enlightening session, and I certainly appreciate the comments of all the participants. To your question, very quickly, I would argue that well, certainly there's no doubt that in this bilateral relationship between Mexico and the US, Mexico is the junior partner. I mean, it just looked for, by any metrics that you want to take, it is clear that the US has a stronger position than Mexico does. But that doesn't mean that Mexico is just selfless. It's left there to be taken advantage of by the US. Quite the contrary, I would argue that negotiating a free trade agreement back either the NAFTA back in 1994 or the USMCA in 2020, I would argue that those agreements actually increase the relative power that Mexico has vis-a-vis the United States for two reasons. One, because as we start creating links for trade and investments, there are some interest for those companies and for those stakeholders in the US into Mexico. The US is the largest investor by far in Mexico, with over $300 billion in the past 20 years. And obviously that matters for companies and for stakeholders in the US. So that gives Mexico a higher leverage, and we certainly punch above our weight when it comes down to defining the terms of the bilateral relationship. Obviously, as Abhijit was mentioning, Professor Abhijit was mentioning, we keep coming back in Mexico in the public debate as to whether or not the sovereignty of my country has been compromised by the agreement. But in realpolitik terms, that is something that we have to live by every single day, and that was even before the NAFTA. So in that sense, I do not believe that engaging in this commercial relationship, on this trade liberalization relationship, has compromised our sovereignty. Probably it certainly has created other type of issues. But in any case, I think that the results are positive in terms of trade, investment, jobs created, so on and so on. It does imply as well that we have to be very mindful of the current agenda, in our case in Washington. What are the topics important for the stakeholders there? What are the topics that the US Congress is paying attention to? Because inevitably that is going to have a reflection in our own country and the policies that we wish or that we can implement. But again, I believe that this is just part of the game, and refusing to participate in it would be counterproductive. Thank you for the opportunity, and I remain at your service.
Thank you, Jan. Coming to you, Anup, similar question. Our two major partners, trading partners, are the US, which wants golden rules in FTAs, and China, which is the factory of the world. US, in many of its FTAs, insists on oversight and extraterritorial enforcement. China is able to dump goods and harm domestic manufacturing. How do you take care of these kinds of issues in FTAs with the big boys?
So, clearly, if you look at China, we have our largest trade deficit with them, and we don't even have an FTA. So the FTA is not the problem. As I mentioned earlier, the problem is competitiveness. And I think what Juan has said is very, very insightful. And it gives a very meaningful lesson to us that having too many fears is not in your best interest. I think from what he said, he's discounting many of the fears that we entertain in going ahead in these relationships. I'll give you the example of Vietnam. Vietnam, even today, and of course certainly till very recently, was nowhere near India's level of development. They went in for liberalization. Today they have 99% zero tariffs with a large part of the world, with EU, with the entire ASEAN, with China through RCEP, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. They are part of TPP. Those FTAs have led to huge investment into Vietnam. And I often ask people, which is the bigger market for an investor? Is Vietnam bigger or is India bigger? And the answer is Vietnam is much bigger. You invest in Vietnam, you have duty-free access to whole of EU, all these countries I mentioned, China, ASEAN, Japan, Korea, all the TPP countries. So I think we overemphasize our fears sometimes. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, you need to be strategic. You can't whole hog blindly go in for all these things. But then I think we've drawn the line too close. We need to further the line a bit. A quick word on the trade deficit. You see, the trade deficit is the main sort of bugbear, so to say, of FTAs. The trade deficit is not bad per se. What does the trade deficit mean? It means you are consuming in welfare terms more than what you are producing. There's some estimate that the US trade deficit gives them at least 5% more welfare than they would have had otherwise. The problem is a trade deficit which reflects a poor level of competitiveness, which makes you over dependent on certain imports, which infringes on your capacity to export. Trade deficit, which is a symptom of that problem, is a different thing. But then the trade deficit per se is not the problem. The problem again is the fact that you're not competitive, so you have to import more than you should be importing from abroad. You cannot export. So this again, we need to keep in mind. And then you look at, our experience in India. You look at 1991, it was the biggest FTA in a sense for us. It was a unilateral liberalization. And then we signed so many other FTAs. If you look at the overall macro picture, are we better off today or were we better off in 1991? We are much better off today. Even our external sector is more stable. We have trade deficits, but you can't look at trade deficits for individual FTAs and say, well, the trade deficit went up, so the FTA is bad. And there again, if you look at the trade deficits in our FTAs, they are explained by this whole element of competitiveness. Our trade FTAs with the non-manufacturing countries, with our neighbors, whether it is Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or whatever, our surpluses went up hugely. Where the FTAs were with manufacturing giants, our trade deficits went up because we missed the manufacturing bus. The FTA was not the problem. For whatever your domestic reasons were, you missed the manufacturing bus, and that was the problem. So the cure is not, that we won't enter into FTAs. I gave the example of China. The worst reflection of our lack of competitiveness, of us missing the manufacturing bus, the worst reflection is India, China. And there's no FTA there. So I'll conclude by saying that we shouldn't, have imaginary fears. And just as Vietnam has the confidence to say that we will go to zero duty on 99% of our products and the world will fear us. That is the kind of confidence you need. The world has reasons to fear India much more than Vietnam if we put our house in order. But protectionism is not the answer for that.
Thank you for that very loud message that competitiveness is the key. There's a huge market, global market out there. Indian market is only 2% of the global market. We need to be competitiveness, and FTAs is one way of doing it. Turning this over to you, Abhijit. If I got you right, you believe with Winston Churchill that the multilateral trading system is the worst system except for the rest. With that view, and the fact that India is very defensive and almost fearful of FTAs, as Anup has also pointed out, unlike the example of Vietnam and ASEAN, also developing countries who have liberalized trade and apparently benefited from it in growth as well as in jobs. If it works for them, why will it not work for us?
Thanks for the question. It's important to just continue with the point which Dr. Vadhavan mentioned. Our objective is to increase trade, right? A better way, rather the first option for us should be to address our own domestic problems in terms of logistics, infrastructure, transportation. And we've started doing a good bit on that through, let's say, the PM Gati Shakti. That really is the way to enhance our exports. FTAs, if we are not very careful in choosing the right partners, what it will do is it will really curtail our flexibility to nurture our domestic sector. And I could go on about what you said, unfound fears, but just to remind ourselves that after we took commitments under the Information Technology Agreement, our domestic value added in IT hardware sector dropped from around 74-75% in 1995-96 to close to about 34, 35% in about 2015. So it's really not about imaginary fears. These are hardcore realities. We have attracted investment in mobile phones after raising tariffs. The tariffs were zero for a pretty long period. We got zero investment, almost zero investment. On the point on Vietnam, there's a very interesting story, if you permit me one extra minute. If we look at Vietnam's exports in 2020, compare it with 2010, oh, it's very shining. The exports increased 4 times. Let's dig a bit deeper. Let's remove the import content of these exports. The sheen goes down quite a bit. If we look at just the domestic value added in Vietnam's exports in 2020 and 2010, this figure of 4 times drops to about 2.7 times. And we've not done worse than that. So let's be mindful of the fact that exports of Vietnam include a huge component of imports. So while WTO may be the worst systems except those not tried out, I would still think that Churchill, for a change, was right over there.
Thank you, Abhijit. Now, Damu, coming to you for your 2 minutes before we throw it open. Before I have my 2 minutes and then throw it open to the audience. You said that FTAs can lead to ambition, right? But if FTAs become the way of doing business, what happens to developing countries and LDCs? I mean, we've seen we have 500 FTAs, but no African country is part of any FTA. The least developed countries have a problem engaging one-to-one and not having the umbrella shield of coalitions. And with your new role as promoting the interests of the South, where does that kind of a discourse lead us, right? Trade deficit may not be the only metric. Value added may be important, but where does this discourse lead the global South?
So thank you, sir. I think there are very significant issues raised here, but I think, let me first reflect on, I think there is something which we all have to recognize, the reality of the global supply chains and what it means for trade. Now, today, we are looking at local manufacturing, but we have to understand, what actually is happening within that local manufacturing. Abhijit mentioned about mobile sets being manufactured from India, but there is something known as the foreign component in that exported segment. Now, Vietnam has achieved it. A foreign component is perhaps percentage-wise very high. Even in the case of India, the mobile phone component today, only about 15-20% is domestic localization, but 80% is a foreign component. But even then, that's good, because then it's economic activity which is generated. It means employment, it means revenue generation. Over a period of time, you will see that that foreign component will start to reduce and then localization takes place. We have to understand the dynamics of trade in the way it will evolve. Now, you talked about what about LDCs and developing countries. Yeah, that is really the problem, because the manufacturing has not happened in those countries, particularly in Africa. Today, Africa is aspirational continent. Is Agenda 2063. What is it talking about? It wants industrialization in Africa, not that its raw material be taken out of Africa. We've given the under the Hong Kong ministerial, you've given the duty-free, quota-free support. India itself has given quota-free, duty-free access into the Indian market. But those are okay to talk about. But if there is no manufacturing, how will it ever export? So today, I think our entire approach to developing countries, least developing countries, as part of the global South is you have to shift some of your manufacturing bases into those countries and then feed your raw materials and components and technology and skills into it and make a finished product in those parts of the world to be able to sell it as a local product and then take advantage of the LDCs enjoying the duty-free, quota-free and export it outside. I think this is again requires a strategic thinking, but we have to consciously do. Many of the countries which have arrived there have done exactly that. Today, Toyotas and Hondas and Hyundais are not made in those countries. Japan doesn't make it to produce it or export it to India. They are actually made in our country. but the components over a period of time have fed into it from outside through the FTA route. But today, Maruti has enjoyed 100% localization. And that is the trajectory that we need to be looking at. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Ramu. We're coming to an end of a very interesting discussion. The key points that I take from this is that I think if time has come when we have to engage with FTAs, but we need to do it in a calibrated manner with large trading blocs, our trade partners, EU, maybe CIS countries, the Continental Free Trade Area in Africa, and the UK, and try to be able to do FTAs which give us real market access without constraining our domestic regulation-making capacity. We can get a lot of preferential access in a number of areas where we are competitive: pharma, textiles, clothing, light engineering, number of agriculture products, professional services, and so on and so forth. Also, FTAs can help us tilt back the balance where we've lost competitiveness in, say, textiles and garments to Vietnam and Bangladesh. Bangladesh gets zero duty access as an LDC. Vietnam, because of its RCEP and CPTPP partnerships, gets zero duty access. Indian textiles have therefore become non-competitive in many parts of the world. The second thing which I take away from here is that we need to have comprehensive agreements. The point was made that investment is, we are looking for investment to grow and to create jobs. So comprehensive agreements which have trade and investment are important. Investment rides on trade. And the Korea and Japan FTAs which we've done are cases in point. The Koreans and Japanese negotiated FTAs where zero duty for steel, used the labor competitiveness of India, brought in investment, and instead of fighting a case against Indian auto policy in the WTO, they created an ecosystem where the Hondas and Hyundais made the place, catering to the Indian market, and today exporting 10 million units to the EU. So comprehensive FTAs are important. The second thing is, the third point is that we need to be clear that there are trade-offs and sacrifices to be made. We have to surrender certain sectors. The Koreans got it early. They said we will not be in any area where we are not in the first three. So they identified electronics, shipbuilding, steel, and the result is that they have companies like Samsung which export more electronics than the whole of India's annual exports. Point which was also made was regarding preparation, reforms, and readiness. We can engage in FTAs, but we need to have policies. We need to have capacity for negotiations and backstop, and we need to have reforms. Negotiations are held between our WTO commitments and our domestic law. So if there's space between our WTO commitment and domestic law, the negotiators can get something in return. For instance, insurance. We could not negotiate with the EU earlier because we did not allow FDI in insurance. Today, insurance, 100% FDI is allowed. Our WTO commitments are minimal. So negotiators in FTAs can give this and get something in return. I keep getting to see how much time I have. The last point is that we need to be a little careful. There needs to be a negative list or red lines as well. And I would say China, for reasons which have been mentioned, and the US on two sides are bears whom we are not yet equipped to take on till we be prepared and we are ready and reformed. For everyone else, India, I think, is ready as far as the FTA journey is concerned. With these words, we have 5 minutes, I'm told. Let me now open this to the audience for a set of questions, and please be specific, and if you can, address a specific member of the panel. Yeah, I see someone there at the back. Please also identify yourself if possible.
So thank you very much for so much of information within so short of period of time. My question to Mr. Anup about the competitiveness and competitive advantage. So competitiveness and competitive advantage rather than tariff. Why not buy with the help of high quality talent across the value chain, including the leadership at your level? Thank you.
Competitiveness has many
Hey,
elements.
Anup, can we take a few more before you address them? This one you address. Yeah, yeah.
So myself, Sudhanu Agopadekar. My question is how the MSMEs, particularly the SMEs, can take advantage of the FTAs because inherently they are also agile. They can move up the value chain quickly, provided they have the access, they have the information, they have the knowledge.
To all. I'm a student from MSc Economics Invoices. My question is to all the panelists. As India with the size and the capacity of a country, should India follow the example of Mexico as first FTAs come to Mexico, then their manufacturing increased, or should they follow the example of China? They started, okay, we'll just invent an infrastructure and then they show that we have the capacity, because both these options looks very lucrative and also comes with problem of both of them.
Thank you. Very, very interesting questions. Anup?
So you see, competitiveness has many facets, and certainly skills and capacities of a technical nature are a part of it. And, the other aspect I want to mention is, which will answer her question also to some extent, it is not a question of, closing doors and developing your infrastructure, developing your competitiveness, and then coming out 10 years down the road as Superman in a Superman costume. That is not the way it works. North Korea is a totally closed economy. They will not emerge as Superman down the road in the international trade scenario unless they do things differently. The example of China is not an example of a country which was closed, not open to trade, and somehow became so competent that they started dominating, world trade. So that is one aspect. And, again, to belabor a point, Vietnam is an example. Now, Abhijit mentioned their achievement 2.7 times in 10 years. I think that outdoes India. Their order of magnitude of exports today is the same as India, around $400 billion. And we are 10 times their size. And they are on the value addition roller coaster. They will start making components. You are making cell phones, you're assembling cell phones because you created an environment where it was competitive for them to come in and assemble. Assembly you made possible. But the same tariff protection will not give you manufacture of components. There again, to again belabor a point, you have to make the environment competitive for that manufacturer to make components also. So that is my response.
Thank you. Juan, would you like to last few words from you?
Thank you. Fascinating, as I said. Well, obviously, I can only tell you about the experience of my own country. In the case of Mexico, we already had a very strong relationship with the US even before the NAFTA. So manufacturing was already happening. That is, some of that manufacturing was already happening. But for us, trying to answer this question as to I will build all the infrastructure necessary and then I will open, or the reverse, was just simply not an option. Mexico knew that because of the size of its market, because of the very slow GDP growth that we had at the time, that we needed to come up with an important boost for the economy, and that represented linking ourselves to the United States. So I would say that you have to do it from our experience. The result has been positive, but doing it simultaneously obviously might not necessarily be an option for another country. The difference that I do see with India, though, is that the size of the market itself, it's several times Mexico's. It's actually larger than China's now. So probably that gives an additional advantage, an additional edge for India to decide on several other options. But clearly, at least in our case, you have to do them both simultaneously. Start building the necessary elements for that at the same time that you are opening.
Damo, your response, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think very quickly, it's not, whether Mexico way or it is the China way. I think both nations perhaps done a lot of preparation. I know when I was in Mexico at the time when NAFTA was being negotiated, there's a lot of interaction with the industry that happened. But only thing is, in the case of China, there is no accountability. They can do whatever they want. So it's much easier to implement the FTA route or liberalization, even unilaterally. I think that's the difference. In our case too, we need to do a lot of preparation for the industry to play the FTA game. But we should not underestimate the ability of the industry to live up to that expectation. I think many often in the policymakers, we think, oh, our industry will die because of FTAs. I think they will reinvent themselves, come out very stronger, and they will compete even better in the global market. That's my sincere thinking and understanding, having interacted with the stakeholders between the negotiating rounds. My takeaway from that is that our industry is very, very competent and they can live up to the expectation. The very important question by Sudanva about MSME. Now, I think this is a very important takeaway from this talks is when I realize in, again, stakeholder consultation, who is asking for actual FTAs is actually MSME is asking for FTAs because we are not able to provide components and raw materials and intermediates at a price that they are asking for. And I think FTA in a way will ensure that that is possible. And that is why when you see the difference today, the MSME survival depends very much on liberalization. Because if you're not able to provide a component at global prices or is beyond the global prices, is what you have to answer. That is the policymakers will have to take that call. Thank you.
Half a minute, Abhijit.
On that question on MSMEs, one very quick example. When India was negotiating with ASEAN and Japan and Korea as well, MSME sector was very clear, particularly the plastic sector. We need raw material. The FTA will be a good route to try to curtail the power of a particular monopoly. So FTAs can be helpful for MSMEs, but there can be challenges, particularly in terms of complying with new environmental norms. I'm going to just stop at that. Thank you.
We've come to the very end, and the pros and cons, the different perspectives are before you. When I joined the Ministry of Commerce, I had this question as well: multilateral or bilateral, plurilateral FTAs. And my boss told me, FTAs ultimately have to be done. They are like, a Bollywood film. Many of you understand what a Bollywood film is. The end is usually a happy ending. The guy almost always gets the girl. So also it's in FTAs. But while it's happening, there's a lot of singing and dancing. So you have to really work for it, prepare, prepare, prepare. With those words, let me extend a very sincere thanks to our scintillating panel who brought in wisdom and knowledge of a high order, some insights which you would not perhaps get elsewhere, so well articulated. So thank you all for this wonderful discussion, and also thanks to our audience for bearing with us, overshooting the time by a little. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in giving them a big hand.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to all our speakers for ending on such a high note, a musical note, if you will. And I want to request the members of the audience to join me in applauding them and all of our speakers today as we end day 2 of the Asia Economic Dialogue 2023. Thank you once again. I request our chair to please hand over a token of appreciation to each of our speakers that are present here today. And I want to thank Mr. Carlos also, who joined from Mexico. And please do stay back on stage for a group photo, and Ambassador Bambawale, if you could please join them. With that, we close proceedings on day 2. PIC would like to invite all members of the audience to dinner, which shall commence at 7 p.m. In the area outside. So do stay back and engage with the PIC team and the speakers and the chairs that are here today. We begin tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. See you all and many more tomorrow. Thank you.